She grew up in a quiet town where expectations were clear and narrow, and where talent was appreciated only when it stayed within safe limits. And from a young age she learned how easily praise could turn into pressure. Her name was Mara, and she was known as disciplined, reliable, and careful, someone who followed instructions closely and never caused discomfort. Music entered her life early through routine rather than passion because her parents believed structure created opportunity and piano lessons fit neatly into that belief. She practiced daily, not with rebellion or drama, but with consistency and patience, and her teachers described her as capable yet reserved. From the outside, her progress seemed steady and uneventful. And that was exactly how the adults around her preferred it. They praised her accuracy, her control, and her ability to follow written notes without deviation. What they did not notice was how deeply she listened, not just to the music, but to her own responses to it. When she played alone, she allowed herself more space, more breath, more feeling. Yet she rarely showed this side to anyone. She learned early that emotion made people uncomfortable, especially when it did not follow expectations. As she grew older, opportunities appeared in predictable ways: recitals, examinations, small competitions. And each time she was reminded to stay composed. Feedback often included the same phrase, "Keep it simple." The words were meant kindly, suggesting restraint, clarity, and respect for tradition. Mara accepted them outwardly while quietly wondering why simplicity was always used to soften expression. She did not want to overwhelm anyone, yet she felt that something essential was being left behind. Music, for her, was not decoration or background, it was conversation, memory, and release. Still, she complied, because compliance kept doors open. Years passed, and she became known for being dependable, the kind of performer organizers trusted not to surprise them. This reputation brought her an invitation to perform in a large historic hall, one known for its tradition and its conservative audience. The event was formal, and expectations were high, and during rehearsals, she was once again reminded to keep it simple. The suggestion came with smiles and reassurance, and she nodded, agreeing without resistance. Inside, she felt a familiar tightening, not fear, but a quiet question that had followed her for years. She prepared carefully, choosing a piece that allowed space without excess, one that could hold depth without appearing dramatic. In the days leading up to the performance, she practiced more slowly, listening closely to how each phrase settled. She paid attention to where she usually held back, and where she might allow herself to be honest without breaking trust. On the evening of the performance, the hall filled with people dressed formally, seated closely together, their presence creating a weight she knew well. Backstage, Mara remained calm, adjusting her posture, breathing evenly, and reminding herself that she was prepared. She was not trying to prove anything, only to play truthfully within the boundaries given. When she walked onto the stage, the lights softened her view of the audience, and the piano waited quietly at the center. She sat and placed her hands on the keys, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to feel the room, not the judgment or expectation, but the shared stillness of people ready to listen. She began gently, letting the opening notes speak without force. The sound traveled easily, filling the hall with warmth rather than volume. As she continued, she noticed how the room responded, not with movement, but with attention. She stayed close to the structure of the piece, honoring its simplicity, yet within that structure, she allowed small shifts in tone and timing, guided by instinct rather than instruction. These choices were subtle and would not have been noticed by someone listening casually, but they carried honesty and intention, and they shaped the emotional arc quietly. As the piece unfolded, she felt herself more present than ever before, not performing, not managing reactions, simply playing. The music moved forward with restraint, yet it carried a depth that surprised even her. She did not think about tears or reactions, only about staying true to what the moment required. When the final notes settled, she lifted her hands and remained still. The silence that followed was not immediate applause, but something heavier. She sensed it before she saw it, the stillness of people absorbing something unexpected. When she finally looked up, she noticed faces softened, eyes glistening, hands resting motionless. The reaction was not loud, but unmistakable. Applause followed slowly, then fully filling the hall with appreciation that felt deeper than approval. Mara stood and acknowledged the audience with humility, feeling grounded rather than elevated. She understood then that simplicity had not been the opposite of emotion, it had been the frame that allowed it to land. That night marked a shift, not in her career, but in her understanding of herself. She realized that she did not need to reject guidance to remain honest. She only needed to listen closely to where truth lived within it. The performance would be remembered by many as moving and unexpected. For Mara, it was a moment of alignment where restraint and expression finally met. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. After the performance, the hall emptied slowly, and the usual low noise of conversation felt muted, as if people were still carrying something fragile with them and did not want to break it. Mara returned backstage and sat alone for a few minutes, letting her breathing return to normal, and she noticed her hands felt warm rather than tense, which was unusual after performances. She did not feel the familiar urge to analyze mistakes or replay moments of doubt, and this absence surprised her more than applause ever had. When the event coordinator came to thank her, his voice was softer than before, and he spoke about the atmosphere rather than technique. He said the audience had been deeply moved, and that several people had asked about the piece not because it was complex, but because it felt sincere. Mara listened and nodded, accepting the words without trying to measure them against past experiences. She packed her music carefully and left the building later than planned, walking out into the cool night air feeling steady. On her way home, she replayed the performance not in search of errors, but to understand why it had felt different. She realized she had stopped performing for approval and instead trusted the quiet decisions she usually hid. This realization stayed with her over the following days. as messages arrived from people she did not know. Some wrote briefly saying the music had stayed with them, while others shared personal memories. The performance had stirred Mara. Read each message slowly, aware that she was being invited into something intimate. She responded kindly, but without explanation, because she knew the experience belonged to the listener as much as to her. Her teacher asked to meet, and during their conversation there was an unfamiliar pause where advice usually lived. Instead, her teacher admitted surprise and said the performance had revealed something that could not be taught. This comment did not feel like validation but recognition, and it settled gently within her. At her next lesson, the instructions were fewer, and the listening deeper, and Mara noticed how that shift affected her playing. She felt less monitored and more trusted, and this trust allowed her to explore without resistance outside the practice room. Her life remained simple and routine, but her relationship with music had changed. She practiced with curiosity rather than obligation, sometimes stopping to sit in silence before continuing. She noticed how silence informed sound, and how restraint could hold more feeling than excess. Opportunities began to appear gradually, invitations to play in similar settings with similar expectations. Each time she was reminded again to keep it simple. And each time she understood the phrase differently, it no longer felt like a limit but a challenge to remain honest. At one small recital, she played another restrained piece, and again noticed the room grow still. Not every performance had the same impact, and she accepted that without disappointment. What mattered was consistency of intention, rather than reaction. She began to trust that when she played truthfully, the right people would hear what they needed. In conversations with peers, she noticed how often they spoke about pressure, comparison, and visibility. Mara listened and shared her experience without framing it as advice. She spoke about attention rather than ambition, and about listening rather than proving. Some nodded, some were skeptical, and she understood both responses. She herself was still learning what it meant to stand in that balance. Her days settled into a rhythm of work, practice, and quiet reflection. She wrote occasionally about music, not in technical terms, but about how it felt to inhabit it honestly. These reflections helped her notice patterns in her own restraint, and where it served her or limited her, she began adjusting, not by pushing harder, but by releasing unnecessary control. In one rehearsal, she chose to take a small risk with phrasing, and the result felt natural rather than dramatic. That moment confirmed what she had sensed since the performance in the large hall. Trusting herself did not require abandoning simplicity. It required presence. As months passed, Mara noticed her confidence was quieter, but more stable. She no longer sought reassurance after performances and instead focused on recovery and rest. Her relationships with organizers and teachers grew more collaborative and less hierarchical. They spoke to her as a musician rather than a student, and this shift changed how she saw herself. She was still careful, still disciplined, still respectful of structure, but she no longer erased herself to maintain those qualities. Music became a place where she could exist fully without justification. This understanding did not come with certainty about the future. She did not know where it would lead or how far it would carry her, but she trusted that the same attention she brought to the piano could guide her choices. And that trust became the foundation for everything that followed. In the weeks that followed, Mara noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with her, both in professional spaces and in quiet personal moments. And while no one treated her like a different person, there was a new attentiveness in conversations that she could feel even when it was not spoken. She continued her regular schedule, teaching younger students, practicing alone, and preparing for upcoming commitments. Yet something in her internal rhythm had shifted, and she no longer rushed through tasks to reach the next obligation. Music had slowed her in a way that felt healthy, and she allowed that pace to influence the rest of her life. When she practiced, she spent more time listening than playing, and this deep listening revealed details she had overlooked before, not technical flaws but emotional habits. She realized how often she had softened phrases, preemptively anticipating judgment before it arrived, and this awareness was uncomfortable but clarifying. Rather than correcting it immediately, she chose to observe it, letting understanding come before change. Her next public appearance was at a modest venue with an audience smaller and less formal than the historic hall, and the expectations were lighter. There was no explicit reminder to keep it simple, but the unspoken assumption remained, and she recognized it easily. As she sat at the piano, she felt a familiar steadiness, and she played with the same restrained honesty, trusting the music to carry its own weight. The response was warm but measured, and she did not search faces for meaning. She accepted the moment as complete without comparison. Afterward, she spoke with several listeners who shared that the performance had made them feel present and calm. These comments resonated with her because they reflected what she herself experienced while playing. She began to understand that her music offered a kind of permission to slow down, and that this quality mattered to people living hurried lives. This realization added a layer of responsibility, not heavy, but mindful. She did not want to manipulate emotion or aim for impact. She wanted to remain truthful and allow whatever rose to do so naturally. Her teacher noticed changes as well, and during lessons allowed more silence after pieces ended. In those silences, Mara learned to trust what had already been said. Rather than rushing to explain it away, they discussed interpretation not as a set of choices, but as a relationship between structure and instinct. These conversations deepened her respect for the discipline she had grown up with while freeing her from its rigidity. Outside music, her relationships evolved quietly. Friends noticed she spoke less about pressure and more about attention and rest. Some found this refreshing, while others struggled to relate. Mara accepted both responses without feeling the need to persuade. She had learned that alignment did not require agreement at home. She spent evenings reading, listening, and sometimes doing nothing at all. This stillness nourished her in unexpected ways. And she noticed how it informed her playing the next day. Moments of doubt still appeared, especially when comparing herself to more expressive or technically dazzling performers. Yet she met these thoughts with curiosity rather than panic. She asked herself whether the comparison served her understanding or distracted. From it, most often it was the latter, and she gently returned her focus inward. As invitations continued to arrive, she chose selectively, guided not by prestige, but by context. She preferred spaces where listening was valued over spectacle. This choice reduced exposure but increased satisfaction. She began collaborating with a small group of musicians who shared similar values, and together they explored repertoire that rewarded subtlety. Rehearsals were unhurried and dialogue replaced instruction. Mara found joy in listening as much as in playing, and this balance strengthened her sense of belonging. One evening during a rehearsal, she played a passage that felt particularly honest, and the room fell into a natural silence. Afterward, no one commented immediately, and that silence felt affirming rather than awkward. Later, a colleague said the moment had felt complete, and no further words were needed. This affirmation reinforced what Mara had sensed since the performance, that moved the hall. Music did not. He explained to be understood. As months passed, she noticed a growing trust in her own timing, both musical and personal. She made decisions more slowly and stood by them more firmly. This steadiness extended to boundaries as well. She declined opportunities that felt misaligned without apology and accepted others with clarity. Her confidence was not louder but deeper, and it anchored her through uncertainty. She continued to practice daily, not out of obligation, but out of respect for the craft and for herself. Each session felt like a conversation rather than a task. She allowed herself to be surprised by what emerged and resisted the urge to shape it prematurely. In this openness, she found growth that felt sustainable. The phrase "keep it simple" no longer echoed as a warning or a rule. It had transformed into an invitation to remain present. Mara understood that simplicity was not the absence of depth, but the absence of pretense. This understanding reshaped how she approached every performance and every day. She did not know where this path would lead or how it would be received long term, but she trusted the quiet strength of attention to guide her forward. And in that trust, she continued to play live and live honestly, allowing music to be both her anchor and her mirror. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As Mara continued along this quieter path, she noticed how her sense of identity as a musician began to separate from external approval, and this separation brought both relief and responsibility. She could no longer blame pressure or instruction for her choices, and this meant she had to listen more carefully to her own intentions. This listening extended beyond music into daily interactions, where she became more aware of when she spoke from habit versus when she spoke from clarity. She began declining conversations that revolved around comparison or competition, and sought instead those that allowed reflection. Some colleagues drifted away while others moved closer, and she accepted both outcomes without resentment. Her playing continued to evolve, not toward greater volume or complexity, but toward precision of feeling. She paid attention to how long notes lingered, and how silence shaped what followed. Audiences responded differently depending on the space, and she learned not to interpret every reaction as a measure of success. In some rooms, people cried quietly, and in others they listened attentively without visible emotion. Both responses felt valid to her. She reminded herself that music was not a tool to extract feeling, but a space where feeling could exist. During one rehearsal, she was asked directly why she played the way she did, and the question surprised her. She answered honestly, saying she wanted the music to feel truthful rather than impressive. The simplicity of that answer settled the room, and no further explanation was needed. Her teacher later reflected that this clarity was rare and often came only after years of confusion. Mara received the comment without pride, understanding that clarity was something to be maintained, not claimed. Outside rehearsals, she spent more time walking alone, letting thoughts arrive and pass without forcing resolution. These walks helped her integrate what she was learning on the piano into how she moved through the world. She noticed how often she had once rushed through life the same way she rushed through phrases. Now she allowed space and found that meaning surfaced naturally. Her performances became fewer but more intentional, and she accepted this trade with confidence. She no longer felt the need to fill every opportunity. Each appearance felt like a conversation she chose to enter. Listeners who returned to hear her again often remarked that her music made them feel grounded. She recognized that this grounding came from her own practice of staying present. There were still moments of uncertainty, especially when facing new repertoire or unfamiliar settings, but she met these moments with patience rather than resistance. She trusted that attention would guide her response. As seasons changed, Mara felt less like she was building something, and more like she was inhabiting something already forming. Her life no longer felt divided between who she was on stage and who she was alone. Those selves had merged quietly. Music remained central, but it no longer carried the weight of proving her worth. It was a practice of listening that shaped how she lived, and through that practice she continued to find balance between simplicity and depth, without needing to choose one over the other. As this balance settled more deeply into her life, Mara began to notice how her choices were guided less by fear of misunderstanding and more by trust in her own judgment. And this shift influenced how she approached new opportunities. She was invited to perform at another respected venue, and during the planning conversation, the familiar suggestion surfaced again to keep the interpretation restrained and accessible. This time, she listened calmly and asked a few thoughtful questions about the space, the audience, and the intent. The event. Her questions were not defensive but clarifying, and the discussion that followed felt collaborative rather than directive. She agreed to the performance, feeling aligned rather than managed in preparation. She returned to the score with fresh attention, not searching for ways to impress, but listening for what felt essential. She practiced slowly, allowing each phrase to settle and noticing where simplicity revealed strength rather than limitation. On the day of the performance, she arrived early and spent time alone in the empty hall, absorbing the acoustics and the quiet presence of the space. When the audience arrived, she felt no urgency to meet their expectations, because she trusted the preparation and the intention behind it. As she played that evening, the music unfolded naturally, and the hall responded with attentive silence. There were moments of intensity and moments of stillness, and she allowed both without shaping them for effect. Afterwards, several listeners approached her not with praise, but with gratitude, saying the performance had given them room to breathe. These words stayed with her because they reflected exactly what she had hoped to offer. She realized then that her music was becoming a reflection of how she wished to live: spacious, attentive, and honest. This understanding brought a quiet satisfaction that did not depend on recognition. She returned home that night feeling complete rather than spent. In the days that followed, she continued teaching and practicing with renewed patience. She encouraged her students to listen more than they played, and to trust what they heard. Some struggled with this approach, while others responded with curiosity, and she supported both reactions. She understood that growth could not be forced, only invited. Her own journey had taught her that as weeks passed, she noticed how easily she now released outcomes. She prepared carefully, played truthfully, and let the rest go. This release created space for joy in small moments, like an afternoon practice that flowed easily or a shared laugh after rehearsal. Music no longer felt like something she carried alone. It existed within a larger rhythm of work, rest, connection, and reflection. She had not become louder or more dramatic. She had become clearer, and that clarity continued to guide her forward, one intentional choice at a time. As this clarity continued to guide her, Mara found that her relationship with uncertainty began to soften, and instead of seeing it as something to overcome, she treated it as a natural part of any meaningful process. She accepted that not every performance would feel complete, and not every rehearsal would bring insight. Some days the music felt distant, and her hands moved without the usual connection, yet she stayed present rather than forcing emotion. This patience allowed her to recognize cycles of effort and rest, and she began honoring both with equal respect. In her teaching, she shared this perspective, gently encouraging students to notice how their bodies and attention shifted from day to day. She emphasized listening over correction and curiosity over judgment. Several students responded with visible relief, realizing they did not need to prove anything in order to belong. These interactions reinforced Mara's belief that music education could be nurturing rather than demanding. Outside the studio, she spent more time with a small circle of friends who valued conversation and quiet activities. They spoke about work, life, and uncertainty without rushing toward conclusions. Mara felt supported not because they understood her music, but because they understood her pace. She noticed how often people were exhausted by the need to be visible, and she felt grateful for the permission she had given herself to step back at performances. She began experimenting subtly with repertoire, choosing pieces that rewarded attention rather than spectacle. She trusted that those who came to listen would meet her where she was. Sometimes the audience response was restrained, and sometimes it was deeply emotional. She accepted both, knowing that her role was to offer presence, not reaction. Her confidence now rested in preparation and intention rather than outcome. This grounded her even when plans changed or expectations shifted. She learned to adapt without losing herself. As months went by, Mara felt less urgency to define her future in clear terms. She allowed it to remain open, guided by the same listening she practiced at the piano. Opportunities continued to appear, and she met them thoughtfully, weighing alignment over advancement. She understood that growth could be quiet and still. Meaningful music remained her anchor, not because it answered questions, but because it taught her how to stay with them. And in staying, she found a sense of stability that carried her forward with calm purpose. As this steadiness settled more firmly into her life, Mara noticed how her sense of time changed, and days no longer felt like steps toward a distant goal, but complete experiences in themselves. She stopped measuring progress by comparison, and began noticing subtler signs such as ease in her shoulders, clarity in her breathing, and patience in her reactions. These changes influenced how she entered rehearsal rooms and conversations, and people often mirrored her calm without realizing why. She began collaborating more frequently with musicians who valued listening and restraint, and these partnerships felt balanced rather than competitive. Rehearsals became spaces of shared attention where ideas were tested gently, and silence was treated as meaningful. Mara found satisfaction in these exchanges because they honored both individuality and connection. She also learned to voice her needs more clearly, asking for time, asking for quiet, and asking for trust. Doing so no longer felt like risk, but like responsibility. When she played in front of audiences, she sensed a deeper mutual presence, as if listening flowed both ways. Some listeners returned again and again, not because they sought surprise, but because they felt grounded by familiarity. Mara recognized that consistency could be just as moving as novelty. In quieter moments, she reflected on how far she had come without dramatic change. Her life looked similar on the surface, yet felt profoundly different within. She no longer braced herself before performances or conversations. She arrived as she was. Music had taught her that honesty did not require intensity, only attention. This understanding shaped how she lived, listened, and chose. And with each passing week, she felt more at home in the balance she had created between simplicity, depth, and quiet strength. As Mara continued living within this balance, she became more aware of how deeply it influenced her sense of belonging, not just in music spaces, but in everyday life. She no longer felt the need to adjust herself to fit rooms, conversations, or expectations, and this ease made her presence feel natural rather than guarded. When she entered rehearsal halls, she noticed how quickly the atmosphere settled, and she understood that calm was something she now carried with her. Younger musicians began approaching her with questions not about technique, but about confidence, fear, and self-trust. She listened carefully, answering in simple terms, sharing experience rather than instruction. She spoke about paying attention to the body, to breath, and to intention before worrying about results. These conversations reminded her of her own earlier uncertainty and strengthened her commitment to honesty. She did not position herself as a model or mentor, yet her way of being offered reassurance. At performances, she felt less separation between herself and the audience. The music flowed as a shared moment rather than a presentation, and this changed how she perceived success. Even when reactions were quiet, she sensed connection, and that was enough. Her practice sessions grew more spacious, and she allowed herself to stop when listening felt complete. She no longer practiced to exhaustion but to clarity. This restraint preserved her energy and deepened her relationship with the instrument. Outside music, she noticed similar patterns emerging. She chose conversations that felt nourishing and stepped away from those that drained her. She rested without guilt and worked without urgency. Life felt less divided into effort and reward. As seasons shifted, she reflected on how simplicity had become a source of depth rather than limitation. The phrase that once felt like instruction now felt like wisdom she had earned. She understood that keeping things simple required courage and trust. And in choosing that path, she had created a life that felt aligned, steady, and quietly meaningful. As time moved forward, Mara noticed that her relationship with fulfillment had changed. And she no longer searched for moments that felt extraordinary, because the ordinary now carried weight and meaning. She found satisfaction in consistency, in showing up prepared, attentive, and open, rather than chasing emotional peaks. This shift allowed her to experience music as part of life, rather than as a separate identity. She played some evenings and spent others in silence, trusting that both were necessary. When doubts appeared, they passed more quickly, because she no longer treated them as signals to change direction. Instead, she listened to what they revealed about fatigue or misalignment, and adjusted gently. Her audience grew slowly, not in number but in depth, and those who listened felt connected rather than impressed. She recognized that this connection came from her willingness to remain present without performance. Opportunities continued to come, and she met them with discernment, choosing those that matched her pace and values. She no longer felt pressured to accept everything offered. This choice protected her energy and preserved her sense of purpose. In conversations, she spoke more freely about uncertainty, and people responded with relief rather than confusion. Her honesty gave others permission to soften their own expectations. She saw how music had trained her to listen beyond sound into intention and silence. This skill shaped her daily life, helping her respond rather than react. She no longer felt divided between discipline and feeling. They had merged into a single approach, grounded in attention. Mara understood that growth did not always look like expansion. Sometimes it looked like settling into what already felt true. And in that settling, she found a form of confidence that did not require validation or display. As Mara reached this stage of her journey, she understood that nothing dramatic had changed on the surface, yet everything meaningful had shifted within her. She continued to play, teach, and live with the same outward simplicity, but her inner world felt settled, clear, and quietly strong. Music no longer felt like something she needed to protect or explain. It was simply how she listened to herself and to the world. When she sat at the piano now, she felt no need to shape the moment for others. She trusted that honesty would find its way without effort. Audiences still listened, and sometimes they cried and sometimes they sat in stillness, and she welcomed both responses equally. She no longer measured impact by reaction. What mattered was that she remained present and true. Her life felt integrated rather than divided. The discipline she had learned early now supported rather than restrained her. Emotion flowed without overwhelming structure. She had found a way to keep things simple without becoming small. The phrase that once felt limiting had become a foundation. In this balance, Mara felt at home in her own rhythm. She did not seek a next breakthrough or a defining moment. She trusted continuity. Each day carried meaning through attention, care, and quiet courage. And in that way of living, she found a lasting peace that allowed both music and silence to exist side by side without conflict.